Crisis at Sydney Airport. A Malaysian Airlines flight was interrupted in its takeoff today at Sydney International Airport after a man jumped up during the takeoff and claimed to have a device on board in his backpack. That's right, Malaysian Airlines flight MH122 was taking off from Sydney Airport at around 1:06 p.m. today when a man described in a Middle Eastern outfit with a grey beard jumped up and said that he had, and I won't repeat the specific phrase that starts with a B on this YouTube channel about aviation, in his backpack, and caused the plane to have to do a turnaround approximately 2 hours after it had left the airport. So they took off, they went around for 2 hours and then had to land at around about 3 p.m. This was an emergency landing and blocked one of the runways, causing up to 23 other flights to either be cancelled or delayed, including international and domestic. As you may know, Sydney Airport is the only major international and domestic hub for the city that has a population of nearly 5 million people, depending on where you're counting. And basically, this got shut down for several hours. The passengers on board the plane were forced to sit there as the federal police were called, and they were able to board and arrest the man, taking him off. Then the passengers were taken away by a bus to a special holding room where they were each interviewed as witnesses to the event. They were then given hotel vouchers, and right now they're only just getting to the hotels, as the federal police and the B squads still search the rest of the plane. So let's deep dive into this story a little bit more, because I think this is probably the most fascinating thing that's happened about 2 kilometers away from where I live here in Sydney. Looking on flight radar, you can see how the plane took off on it, but then after about an hour had to turn back over the middle of New South Wales to then make the long return back to Sydney, which is obviously very frustrating because at the peak of its time it had reached 35,000 feet. So they're at cruising altitude. So what exactly happened on board? After takeoff, when the plane left Sydney Airport, the passenger jumped up and started accusing other passengers of whether or not they were with Allah. And we have a video of this person on board the plane, and viewers may find the following distressing. He would go up to passengers and say, "I am Muhammad, I am a slave of Allah. Are you a slave of Allah?" And asking random people on the plane whether or not their religious beliefs were similar to his. I don't know if you can see this in the footage, but if you look at the cabin crew's face, you can see them almost finding the entire thing rather hysterical. But I assure you, they probably dealt it with the most serious way. I definitely know that these cabin crew, this is not their first rodeo. Malaysia, of course, is a Islamic nation, so most of the cabin crew who are on this plane, I would assume all of them are actually Islamic as well, so it's a very random thing for this man to be running up and asking the cabin crew if they are, as I quote, a slave of Allah. The passengers on board were quite distressed by this, and eventually the captain decided to return the plane back to Sydney at around about 3 p.m, which is a relatively long time, but you can see that the cabin crew tried to coax this man back to his seat and to calm down as to not disturb the flight for the rest of the passengers. Then they really gunned it quite far back. In fact, I've never seen a plane get that quick back to Sydney before, and I wish it was something they would normally do, but clearly they got full priority, and you can see that there is no holding pattern when they were coming over Sydney here, which is very atypical of a normal flight over Sydney, Australia. Sydney Airport was completely shut down. So it was actually 32 flights. 32 domestic flights were cancelled and dozens of others were significantly delayed. And remember, Sydney to Melbourne is the second most popular air route in the world, so we're talking about thousands of passengers whose Monday plans were cancelled. The police were very quick to point out that there was no threat to the community and that the threat was false. This just seems to be a person who was a little bit more imaginative with their attempts to hijack this flight, and it's unclear whether he wanted to stop the flight returning to Malaysia or if he was trying to do some sort of other message. This will probably be revealed over time when more facts from the story come out. Jumping to Twitter, you can see that Sydney Airport put out a first statement saying they're currently supporting emergency agencies in the management of an incident at the airport. The airport is still operational with other flights arriving and departing, although this was not actually the case where we saw that 32 flights were actually cancelled. Passengers were still encouraged to check in directly with their airline in regards to the status of their flight. In addition, the AFP was also asked to comment, who said that they were just responding to an emergency incident at Sydney Airport and that they would give an appropriate update, which they did that we mentioned earlier in the story. Malaysia Airlines then issued a statement to the media saying, "In the interest of safety, the commander of this flight made the decision to return to Sydney." And we can see passengers on board have taken photos of the man, with the other passengers being moved to other sections. So it's obviously not a very full flight. Many passengers were frightened by this event and were very glad to return back to soil. So it's unclear exactly what will happen now to this passenger after he claims these things about his backpack and he disturbed other passengers. It's also unclear exactly what is rumor and fact in this situation, apart from how scared the passengers were and the fact that this plane had to return. So whether or not this man faces criminal charges is unknown at this time, but it's very clear that he won't be flying anywhere anytime soon. If you enjoyed this little news update, be sure to check in here with Aviation Station. This is a very random setup that I'm doing here today, just sitting here in the middle of my lounge room, but I hope that you enjoyed this little video of something that happened just around the corner from me. Enjoy the rest of your day.